December 1944. A ruined French village lay buried beneath a silence that followed fire. The snow had turned red hours ago. Now it was only ash and breathless cold. Inside the shattered remains of a barn, a line of wounded men waited, their gray uniforms stiff with blood and frost. They were Germans, captured near Hürtgen Forest, faces hollow, eyes wide with disbelief that they were still alive. Across from them, American medics worked under a hanging lantern. Their gloves were dark with dried blood, yet their movements were calm, precise, almost gentle. A young doctor from Ohio knelt beside a German corporal whose leg was shattered. The prisoner flinched, expecting the cold steel of vengeance. Instead, he felt the warmth of morphine and heard a voice. Quiet, firm, almost fatherly. "Hold on, son. You're going to make it." For the first time since the war began, the German soldier trembled. Not from pain, but from confusion, because in that moment, his enemy had chosen to save him. By the winter of 1944, the Western Front had become a corridor of human exhaustion. The Allied push that began with the Normandy landings was grinding its way through France and Belgium, but victory had turned into a slow crawl through mud, snow, and broken men. Every mile gained came at the cost of hundreds of wounded, not only Allied, but German as well. As the German army collapsed, entire divisions surrendered in clusters. Tens of thousands of prisoners, many barely 18, stumbled into American hands. They were starving, frostbitten, and terrified. The propaganda that had shaped them warned that capture meant torture or death. Instead, they found American field hospitals. These were not grand facilities. They were canvas tents pitched in frozen fields, filled with the smell of ether, sweat, and blood. The 45th Evacuation Hospital near Liège, for instance, treated more than 1,000 men in 1 week, half of them enemy soldiers. The Geneva Convention demanded humane treatment of POWs. But what happened in those wards went beyond regulation. It was a quiet, human defiance against the brutality of war itself. American doctors and nurses were trained to see only wounds, not uniforms. Men from New York and Kansas worked side by side, lifting German soldiers onto tables once meant for their own comrades. The moral clarity of their mission came not from command orders, but from conscience. Surgeon Captain Harold Cummins later wrote, "There was no room for hate. Blood is blood. Once the shooting stops, you're just trying to keep a heart beating." To the prisoners, this mercy was incomprehensible. They had been taught that Americans were barbarians, gangsters without honor. Yet the first thing they encountered was a medic offering water, a cigarette, or a blanket. For many, it was their first act of kindness in years. The numbers were staggering. By early 1945, more than 370,000 German POWs were in American custody in Europe alone. Field hospitals struggled to keep up. Supplies ran low, and stretchers filled faster than they could be cleared. Medics improvised, using parachute silk for bandages, Jeep headlights as surgery lamps, and melted snow for sterilization. Yet through all of it, one rule held firm. The enemy wounded were treated first if their condition was worse. This was not sentimentality. It was discipline. The U.S. Army Medical Corps believed that moral order must survive even when civilization collapsed. The Red Cross recorded countless reports of German prisoners describing disbelief. One diary found after the war read, "I thought they would kill us. Instead, they gave us chocolate. The doctor looked into my eyes as if I were a man, not a Nazi." But beneath this mercy was fatigue. American medics were haunted by the same nightmares that filled the skies of Bastogne and Aachen. The endless influx of broken bodies, the sound of muffled cries behind the canvas walls, the moral weight of choosing who would live or die. Still, the hospitals functioned with the precision of conscience. They were islands of light amid a continent swallowed by smoke. Each night generators hummed softly, illuminating the white tents like lanterns across a battlefield. Inside, the sound of metal tools clinking in trays, mixed with murmured prayers, in English, in German, in silence. For the prisoners, the pain was not only physical, it was a collapse of ideology. How could the men they had been told were monsters kneel beside them, stitching their wounds with patience? The answer lay not in politics, but in something deeper, a form of victory that no weapon could achieve. The Americans were proving that humanity itself could survive total war. And as 1945 approached, that quiet defiance, fought not with bullets, but with compassion, would reshape how both sides saw each other. And what would come after the guns went silent? Behind every battlefield victory in 1944 lay a hidden war, one fought not with rifles, but with scalpels and morphine. The United States Army Medical Department had perfected a chain of survival unmatched by any other nation in the conflict. From the beaches of Normandy to the Ardennes forests, it operated like a moving artery, collecting the wounded, stabilizing them under fire, and sending them backward through a network of aid stations, field hospitals, and evacuation units. The system began at the front lines. Medics carried only what they could fit in their packs: sulfa powder, bandages, and a few doses of morphine. They crawled through mud and machine gun fire searching for any sign of life. Their Red Crosses were supposed to protect them, but snipers didn't always care. For every life they saved, another medic fell beside his patient. Those who survived the front were carried to collecting stations, where corpsmen tagged the wounded and made split-second decisions. Who could wait? Who could walk? Who was already gone? From there, the injured were moved to field hospitals, often within range of artillery. In these temporary sanctuaries, surgeons worked in 12-hour rotations. The smell of ether mixed with diesel fumes and candle wax. Instruments were boiled, hands trembled, and blood pooled faster than it could be mopped away. A single tent might treat 30 men before dawn, Allied or Axis alike. The Americans were under strict orders to follow the 1929 and 1943 Geneva Conventions, which demanded equal medical treatment for enemy prisoners. Yet for most doctors it wasn't law that guided them. It was instinct. The Hippocratic Oath did not distinguish between uniforms. Captain Eugene F. Lapointe, a surgeon attached to the 3rd Armored Division, later recalled a night near Mons, Belgium. A German was brought in with half his chest gone. My nurse looked at me. We had 1 bottle of plasma left. We gave it to him. He died anyway, but at least he didn't die thinking we were animals. Such moments defined the unseen moral front of the war. For many Americans, it was their first close encounter with the enemy as individuals, not as targets. And for German soldiers raised under a regime of dehumanization, it shattered a lifetime of indoctrination. The Red Cross and Medical Corps photographic units documented these field operations meticulously. Photos from the 5th Field Hospital near St. Vith show rows of captured Germans lying beside Americans. The same blankets, same splints, same silent exhaustion. One nurse wrote in her journal, "When they sleep, they look the same." Even in prisoner of war camps far from the front, the standard of care was unexpectedly high. At Camp Ashford in England and Camp Atterbury in Indiana, German doctors were sometimes allowed to assist in surgeries on their own men, under American supervision. It was both symbolic and practical, a gesture that hinted at reconciliation long before the war was over. The logistics were monumental. Every captured German required food, water, and medical inspection. The U.S. Quartermaster Corps worked alongside medical officers to ensure sanitation, vaccinations, and disease control, a massive undertaking that stretched Allied supply lines to the limit. By early 1945, as American forces crossed the Rhine, the flood of POWs became a humanitarian emergency. Many German divisions collapsed without formal surrender, leaving behind thousands of wounded. Field hospitals converted barns, schools, even churches into makeshift wards. Doctors slept on stretchers beside their patients, too exhausted to notice the difference between friend and foe. Among the wounded were not only soldiers but also Volkssturm conscripts, old men and boys drafted in Hitler's final desperation. Some were barely 16. Many had never seen an American before. The kindness they received from enemy doctors often left them speechless. An American medic's letter home captured the paradox. We're patching up the same people who tried to kill us a week ago. I don't know what that means anymore, but I know it feels right. The war's cruelty had not vanished, but within those tents, it was held at bay, one wound at a time. This fragile compassion, repeated across thousands of moments from Normandy to Remagen, did more than save lives. It began to rehumanize a generation that had been taught to despise mercy. And as the front lines inched closer to Germany, this tension between duty, vengeance, and compassion would reach its most powerful expression inside the American field hospitals scattered along the Western Front. Because soon, the wounded arriving on stretchers would no longer be anonymous soldiers. They would be believers, officers of the Waffen-SS, loyal to the ideology that had scorched Europe, and what the Americans chose to do next would test the very limits of what it meant to be civilized. For most German prisoners, the war ended not with a surrender, but with a stretcher. They arrived in American care half-conscious, bleeding through their greatcoats, staring at faces they had been told were monsters. Many trembled at the first touch of a medic's hand, expecting torture disguised as treatment. Some tried to crawl away, others simply closed their eyes and waited for death. But what met them was something no manual of war had prepared them for: calm, clinical compassion. To understand the shock of these moments, one must remember what these men had been taught. For years, Nazi propaganda painted the Allies, especially Americans, as violent, soulless opportunists. Pamphlets claimed they mutilated prisoners. Radio broadcasts warned that surrender meant degradation. Even German military manuals advised soldiers to prefer death to capture. And yet in muddy tents behind American lines, those same enemies were being lifted gently onto tables, given morphine, stitched up, and offered water. The human dissonance was unbearable. Some German officers resisted care at first. They would clutch their Iron Cross medals or whisper, "Ich will nicht," I don't want it. But resistance faded quickly under pain and exhaustion. What lingered was confusion. Corporal Franz Behrendt, captured near St. Lo, later recalled, "I thought they would laugh at us or hit us. Instead, they carried me. One man covered me with his jacket. I thought he was mocking me. He wasn't." Such testimonies were not rare. From 1944 onward, thousands of captured Germans described their astonishment in Red Cross reports. It was not kindness they expected from America, but contempt. The realization that the enemy could be humane often broke something inside them, something deeper than loyalty. To the Americans, this was not an act of theater or charity. It was simply procedure. To the Germans, it felt like grace. Behind that grace was a medical system running at the edge of collapse. And genius. World War II turned battlefield medicine into an industrial art form. The Americans refined mobile surgical hospitals, triage hierarchy, and blood plasma transport on a scale never seen before. The 45th, 77th, and 108th evacuation hospitals became lifelines stretching across the Western Front. A wounded soldier's journey often began in the mud. From there he was hauled by stretcher-bearers to a battalion aid station, a tent or a ruined house with one medic and a handful of supplies. If he survived long enough, he would be taken by jeep or ambulance to a field hospital, where surgeons waited with makeshift operating tables. Here, triage ruled everything. Urgent cases went first, regardless of uniform. Americans treated Germans if their injuries were more severe, an act that baffled even some of their own. The policy was not sentiment. It was strategy and ethics combined. Saving a man, even an enemy, preserved order amid chaos. Dr. Howard Strickland, chief surgeon at the 24th Field Hospital, described it simply. "We didn't see Nazis. We saw wounds. And wounds are just the same color underneath." That ethos became the unspoken law of the wards. A medic might remove a grenade fragment from a German arm 1 hour and amputate an American leg the next. The rhythm was brutal, mechanical, but the intention was moral. By late 1944, the U.S. Army Medical Corps had treated over 100,000 Axis wounded in Europe. The same plasma that revived Allied paratroopers at Bastogne flowed into the veins of German prisoners. To the Americans, it was duty. To the Germans, it was disarming. For many of the captured, healing itself became a kind of interrogation, not by words, but by mercy. Imagine the scene. A German artillery officer lies under white sheets, his shoulder bandaged, hearing English spoken gently above him. The same language that barked through megaphones during air raids now whispered, "You'll be all right." He turns away, weeping quietly, because the care feels unbearable. It collapses everything he believed about strength, superiority, and worth. The nurses and orderlies noticed this too. Some reported that prisoners would thank them only in whispers, as if gratitude were forbidden. One nurse from the 45th evacuation wrote, "They would cry when we changed their bandages, not from pain, but because they didn't understand why we helped." Among the American staff, these reactions stirred mixed emotions: pride, sorrow, even guilt. Many of the medics had lost friends to German bullets only days before. Yet here they were, sewing shut the wounds those same rifles had caused. Mercy was not easy. It was an act of discipline. And so intense, lit by weak lanterns, two enemies met without weapons, and realized how little separated them. One offered life, the other received it in disbelief. By early 1945, this quiet ritual repeated across every battlefield from Normandy to the Rhine. Thousands of prisoners left those hospitals with scars and stories they would never forget. Stories that, decades later, would form the foundation of a different kind of German memory, that of being treated as human by those they had dehumanized. The war had not ended, but something inside it had begun to heal. War reveals not only the limits of endurance, but the boundaries of conscience. By 1944, those boundaries were tested daily inside the American medical tents scattered across the Western Front. While artillery thundered in the distance, men in white coats fought a quieter battle: how to remain human amid the inhuman. For most American medics, the moral code was clear. Their loyalty was to life itself. But that clarity came at a cost. Imagine dressing the wounds of a man whose comrades had killed your friends hours earlier, and doing it without hesitation. That demanded more courage than combat. Colonel Paul R. Hawley, the U.S. Army's chief surgeon in Europe, once said, "We fight to end killing." The moment a man falls wounded, he's no longer an enemy. He's our responsibility. This idea, radical in its simplicity, became the quiet soul of America's wartime medical doctrine. It was how the United States sought to distinguish itself from the world it was trying to rebuild. To German prisoners, this morality was almost alien. Their system had conditioned them to believe mercy was weakness. But in those American hospitals, mercy was power, a kind of strength that didn't demand surrender, only recognition. It was a lesson more enduring than any battlefield victory. The human mind does not surrender as easily as a rifle. Many German soldiers entered captivity carrying invisible wounds: shame, confusion, indoctrination. For years, they had been taught that the Reich stood above all nations, that its enemies were subhuman. Then, in a single moment of defeat, that entire illusion shattered. And it shattered hardest when their enemies began saving their lives. American psychologists embedded within POW systems soon noticed something striking. Acts of compassion produced more profound behavioral changes than any interrogation could. Soldiers who once recited Nazi slogans in defiance now sat quietly, staring into the distance after surgery, as if trying to reconcile two versions of reality. Private Wilhelm Kopp, captured near the Ardennes, recalled, "They gave me blood from an American soldier. I don't know his name. Maybe he died. Maybe he lived. But since that day, I cannot say the word enemy the same way again." That kind of psychological break was not accidental. It was transformative. The Americans understood that rehabilitation began not with punishment, but with exposure to decency. It wasn't leniency. It was moral disarmament. In post-war interviews, U.S. officers described how this treatment often led to spontaneous cooperation. German POWs began volunteering to help in hospitals, organizing supplies, even translating for others. Compassion had rewired their loyalties. not toward America, but toward humanity itself. Yet for the Americans, this too carried an emotional weight. Some medics confessed to nightmares, faces of Germans they had saved returning in dreams, blending with those of their fallen comrades. Mercy, it seemed, demanded its own kind of endurance. For the Germans, defeat was supposed to be a kind of moral death, humiliation, scorn, and abandonment. But the Americans refused to play that part. In German letters and diaries, fragments of gratitude began to appear, hesitant, guilt-ridden, but sincere. A Luftwaffe pilot, treated after being shot down over Belgium, wrote, "The American doctor told me, 'You'll fly again someday, just not for Hitler.' I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. I still don't." That sentence captured the bewilderment of an entire generation. Men who had built their identities on supremacy, now being saved by those they had called inferior. The shock was so deep that German propagandists struggled to explain it. Nazi radio dismissed reports of humane American treatment as Allied deception, but returning prisoners contradicted them. By 1945, many captured Germans were telling their comrades, "If you must surrender, surrender to the Americans." Even within the ranks of the Waffen-SS, where loyalty to the Reich was absolute, the impact was visible. Wounded SS officers who expected execution were stunned to find themselves receiving the same care as ordinary soldiers. Some refused to eat, believing it was a trick. Others broke down, realizing it wasn't. This mercy, quietly and consistently practiced, became one of the Allies' most potent moral victories. Without propaganda, without speeches, the Americans demonstrated an idea stronger than any ideology: that civilization does not end when the shooting starts. Compassion in war is often mistaken for softness. But in those field hospitals, compassion became discipline, a weapon that undermined everything the Nazi worldview stood for. It told the defeated that dignity could survive even their defeat. Many German POWs would carry that memory for the rest of their lives. In post-war Germany, interviews revealed recurring phrases. "They treated us like men, and they saved my faith in people." For a nation trying to rebuild its soul, those words mattered more than any treaty. By healing their enemies, the Americans had done something profound. They had forced the defeated to witness the moral contrast between tyranny and democracy, not through rhetoric, but through touch. A bandaged wound spoke louder than any flag. And beneath the roar of war's last months, that quiet, relentless mercy became a kind of music. The sound of humanity refusing to die. March 1945. The city of Aachen had been reduced to rubble, a skeleton of stone, and smoke clinging to the western edge of Germany. Allied artillery echoed through the night, shaking the ruins as rain fell in thin, freezing sheets. Beneath what was once a railway station, a small American field hospital flickered with lantern light. Inside, the war was not being fought. It was being undone. The 45th Evacuation Hospital had been pushed dangerously close to the front line. Wounded Americans and captured Germans filled every cot, the air thick with the smell of iodine and cordite. The walls trembled each time a shell landed nearby, sending dust across trays of instruments. Outside, ambulances kept coming, their tires splashing through blood and mud, headlights dimmed to slivers. That night, around 200 hours, a convoy arrived carrying a mix of Allied and Axis wounded. Among them was a German officer, an SS Hauptsturmführer, his black uniform torn, his face pale with shock. He had been pulled from a burned half-track, unconscious, with shrapnel lodged near his heart. The staff hesitated. Even in defeat, the black uniform carried a shadow. Many of the nurses had seen what SS men had done in Normandy and the Ardennes. Some had lost friends to them. Now one lay before them, gasping for air. Captain Thomas Keene, a young surgeon from Illinois, ordered the stretcher to the table. "Tag him Priority 1, he said simply. The nurse beside him froze. "Sir, that's a German." "SS." Keene didn't look up. "Then he's still bleeding." It was not an act of sentiment. It was a declaration of order. The same order that held the moral line when everything else had fallen apart. The operation began as the guns outside intensified. The lamps flickered with each blast, illuminating faces drawn tight with focus. Keen's hands moved quickly, guided by routine and exhaustion more than thought. He reached the shrapnel, a jagged piece of iron lodged deep near the lung. Removing it was a gamble. Leaving it meant certain death. Through the haze of anesthesia, the German began to stir. His lips moved, whispering fragments of prayer or command. No one could tell. The nurse steadied his arm. Another shell landed closer, rattling the ceiling. Dust rained down. For a moment, all power died. The room went black. In the silence, Keen's voice broke through. "Light! Someone get me a light!" A medic held up a small flashlight. The beam cut across the officer's face. Pale, terrified, human. Keen found the artery, clamped it, and worked by that narrow glow until the power returned. The operation lasted 47 minutes. When it was over, the man was alive. Barely. Outside, the bombardment eased. Dawn began to show through the broken window panes, gray light spilling across rows of cots, bandaged faces, and collapsed orderlies. Keen stepped back, peeled off his gloves, and looked at the motionless German. "He'll make it," he said quietly. The nurse who had questioned him earlier didn't respond. She just stared at the patient, then at the surgeon. "How do you do it?" she finally asked. Keen answered without hesitation, "Because if we don't, we become them." Hours later, the hospital was evacuated as the front moved east. The SS officer, still unconscious, was transferred with the others to a Red Cross transport convoy. None of the staff ever learned his name. He disappeared into the system of POW camps that stretched across Germany and France, one of millions. But that night, something invisible had been proven. Compassion, when everything screamed for revenge, was not weakness. It was the last defense of civilization itself. The German who had expected death awoke 2 days later under an American blanket. His chest was bandaged, his throat dry. A tag on his wrist read simply, "Enemy wounded, treated." He stared at it for a long time. No words, no slogans, no oaths, just that quiet truth. In the ruins of Aachen, where centuries of war had come to their crescendo, one act of mercy had cut deeper than any victory. As American forces pushed east toward the Rhine, scenes like this repeated across hundreds of makeshift hospitals. The same ritual, the same contradiction, healing the enemy in the middle of destruction. But in Aachen, something changed. The moral war was won long before the guns fell silent. The story of that night in Aachen did not end with the operation table. By dawn, word had spread quietly among the wards. An American surgeon had saved an SS officer. Some whispered it with pride, others with unease. But for every man or woman who heard it, the message was the same, that mercy was now a weapon stronger than hate. The mood in the field hospitals began to shift. At first, no one noticed. A German orderly, captured and pressed into assisting the medical staff, began fetching supplies without being asked. A wounded American private, whose arm had been amputated, later gave his spare blanket to a German across from him. It was small, instinctive, human, and it kept happening. The front lines had become a strange mirror world where enemies no longer knew how to behave as enemies. In one ward outside Liège, a captured German medic named Hans Reuter volunteered to assist American nurses during a plasma shortage. He had been trained under Nazi command. But when he saw the chaos of the wounded, American, British, and German alike, something in him cracked open. "I can't watch them die," he said in broken English. "Not after all this." The Americans hesitated at first. Trusting a German in a medical tent was unthinkable. But desperation overruled doubt. Reuter worked 12 hours straight, cleaning wounds, carrying stretchers, and translating for captured soldiers who couldn't understand their doctors. When one American officer thanked him, he simply said, "You did this for us first." It wasn't an isolated moment. Reports from multiple divisions recorded similar scenes. German prisoners helping feed or transport Allied wounded. The Geneva Convention permitted such assistance, but what emerged was more than compliance. It was redemption in motion. Men who had once served the Reich were now saving the lives of those they were ordered to destroy. In a war where vengeance had become currency, that was revolution. Not everyone could accept it. Some American soldiers resented the compassion being shown to their enemies. To them, mercy looked like betrayal. Sergeant Raymond Cole of the 2nd Infantry Division wrote in his diary, "I can't stand seeing those bastards getting clean bandages while my buddies lie cold in the rain. The doctors say it's the right thing. Maybe it is, but it doesn't feel right." It was an honest anger, the kind that burns between principle and pain. Yet it was precisely that tension that defined the moral test of 1945. The medical corps, caught between vengeance and virtue, chose restraint. Every time they operated on an enemy soldier, they reaffirmed something the war was trying to erase, that the rules of humanity mattered even when no one was watching. Captain Keane himself faced criticism. An officer from another regiment accused him of wasting resources on killers. Keane's reply was cold and simple. "If I start deciding who deserves to live, then I'm no longer a doctor." Those words traveled farther than bullets ever could. Within weeks, the phrase, "no longer a doctor," became a quiet motto whispered among medics from Normandy to the Moselle River. It was a line they refused to cross. On the other side, among the German prisoners, something equally profound was happening. For years, they had fought believing the Allies would destroy them if captured. When that destruction never came, when instead they were healed, fed, and given dignity, it shattered the propaganda that had defined their world. POW interviews after the war revealed a recurring pattern: disbelief giving way to guilt, then to gratitude. One captured officer confessed to an American chaplain, "I feel ashamed that you saved me. I don't know how to live with that." Another, a 19-year-old infantryman from Cologne, wrote home, "They treat us as humans. If this is what freedom looks like, then maybe we were wrong." Those letters, intercepted and archived by Allied intelligence, became some of the most powerful psychological weapons of the war. They showed the cracks forming inside the defeated, not from bombs, but from kindness. Late in March, during a retaliatory air raid on the Allied position near Remagen, the hospital tents were hit. Fires broke out, and shrapnel tore through the canvas. Dozens of wounded, American and German, screamed as the sky fell in orange and steel. Then, something extraordinary happened. The German prisoners, many still bandaged, began pulling Americans out of the wreckage. They carried stretchers, used blankets to smother flames, and even took over medical tasks when nurses were injured. An American doctor later recalled, "I saw a German soldier with one arm dragging a U.S. lieutenant by the collar, shielding him from debris." I'll never forget that sight. When the chaos subsided, 3 Germans had died rescuing Americans. Their names were never recorded. Only a note in the hospital log. "Assisted during air raid. Died in service of all." It was no propaganda moment. There were no cameras, no speeches, just exhausted men on both sides realizing that survival had erased the lines between them. The night in Aachen had planted a seed. Weeks later, it had grown into something larger than any order could dictate. A quiet, mutual understanding that the war's end would not be measured by victory parades, but by whether mercy had survived it. By April, as American forces crossed deeper into Germany, the moral outcome of the war was already decided. Not on the battlefields, but in the hospitals. The Reich had lost more than territory. It had lost its monopoly on meaning. And in the ruined heart of Europe, that meaning was being rewritten. Not with flags, but with sutures and outstretched hands. When the guns finally went silent in May 1945, Europe exhaled, not in relief, but in disbelief. The war was over. But what remained looked less like peace and more like exhaustion carved into stone. Millions of soldiers stumbled home across the ruins of a continent that no longer knew itself. And among them were the German prisoners who had survived not because of power, but because of mercy. The experiences inside American field hospitals stayed with them long after the fences went up around POW camps. At first, those camps were austere: barbed wire, wooden barracks, mud. Yet compared to the Eastern Front or Nazi labor camps, they were worlds of civility. The Geneva Convention had been not just followed, but embodied. Food, clean water, letters, and medical care became part of daily life. American doctors continued their work, now aided by the very men they had once treated as enemies. German medics, nurses, and orderlies were allowed to assist under supervision. For many, it was their first taste of a world without ideology, a world where professionalism replaced propaganda. The U.S. Army Medical Department's post-war reports noted something remarkable. Incidents of hostility among German POWs declined sharply when assigned to hospital units or medical details. The act of care transformed the captor-captive dynamic faster than any other intervention. It wasn't rehabilitation by design. It was healing by example. Letters from captured. Germans began reaching families in the shattered Reich. Their words often carried an unexpected reverence. One former Wehrmacht lieutenant wrote from a camp in France. "The Americans did not treat us as beasts. They gave us soap, bandages, even books. One of their doctors saved my hand. I can write again? Tell our people, the enemy is not what we were told." Those letters were quietly revolutionary. In a nation built on dehumanization, they became seeds of rehumanization, proof that dignity could survive defeat. For wives, mothers, and children reading those words amid rubble, it was perhaps the first glimpse of a moral world beyond Hitler's empire. For American doctors and medics, the end of the war brought reflection, and in some cases, remorse. They had witnessed horrors and mercy in equal measure, and both had left marks on the soul. Many had treated the same faces multiple times, once as foes, later as fellow humans. Captain Thomas Keane, the surgeon who had operated in Aachen, returned home in late 1945. He spoke rarely of combat, but often of that night, of the SS officer who had survived, and of what that survival had taught him. In an interview years later, he said, "We didn't just save bodies. We saved the idea that men could still be decent in a time when decency was dying." Across America, returning medics carried similar memories. Some couldn't shake the feeling that they had glimpsed the true purpose of the war. Not the destruction of fascism alone, but the preservation of humanity itself. The U.S. Army published detailed studies of POW medical treatment, emphasizing its long-term psychological value. These findings would later shape post-war humanitarian efforts, influencing the design of the Geneva Convention of 1949 and the establishment of international medical codes that demanded impartial care in all conflicts. For many Americans, compassion had proven its strategic worth. It turned enemies into witnesses who would carry stories home that no Allied broadcast could match. Inside Germany, the legacy of that compassion began to surface in subtle ways. Former POWs returned home to cities of dust and silence, carrying memories that didn't fit the ruins around them. Many had lost everything: families, homes, faith. But they had also seen another kind of civilization, one that did not need conquest to prove its strength. In the years that followed, thousands of these men became teachers, doctors, and civil servants in the new Federal Republic. Some explicitly credited their transformation to the Americans who had treated them. One former SS officer, later interviewed by a journalist in 1962, said, "When they stitched me up, I understood that everything I believed was a lie. They could have let me die. They didn't. That's why I became a doctor." These stories, though rarely told publicly, echoed quietly through post-war reconstruction. The Marshall Plan rebuilt cities. American mercy had helped rebuild consciences. The war had torn nations apart, but inside those hospital tents, something enduring had been created. A shared recognition that the line between enemy and ally is thinner than a heartbeat. For the Americans, compassion had been a choice. For the Germans, it had been a revelation. Together, in those fleeting moments between pain and peace, they had rediscovered what it meant to be human. When the war ended, most of the tents were packed away. The stretchers burned, and the medics sent home. But what had taken place inside those field hospitals did not vanish with the smoke. It lingered. in military manuals, in courtrooms, in the conscience of two nations learning to live again. The United States Army Medical Department immediately began cataloging every lesson learned from 6 years of global war. They recorded not only surgical innovations but moral case studies, incidents where American medical staff had treated Axis wounded under impossible conditions. These reports, dry in tone but profound in implication, became the unseen foundation of a new kind of warfare, one that demanded humanity as a condition of victory. In one 1946 memorandum, Surgeon General Norman T. Kirk wrote, "The preservation of life, regardless of allegiance, stands as a cornerstone of our conduct. We fought tyranny not only with weapons, but with principles." That sentence would later echo through the halls of Geneva and The Hague. By 1947, Allied lawyers and physicians were collaborating on revisions to the Geneva Conventions. Their experiences in field hospitals, especially those that treated Axis wounded, served as primary evidence that compassion was not weakness but discipline. When the Geneva Convention of 1949 was finally ratified, it included explicit language guaranteeing medical care for prisoners of war without any adverse distinction founded on nationality, race, religion, or political opinion. Those words had not been written in theory. They had been written in blood, plasma, and exhaustion by men and women who had practiced them first in chaos. The Americans had proven that moral restraint was compatible with total war and essential to surviving it. The Nazi regime, by contrast, had used medicine as a tool of cruelty, turning doctors into instruments of ideology. The contrast was so stark that it became part of the Nuremberg doctors' trial, where U.S. prosecutors cited the conduct of American field medics as evidence of the ethical standard the world must never abandon again. It was a rare moment when victory was measured not by conquest, but by conscience. As the Cold War dawned, many of those same American doctors returned to military service, now as instructors. They taught young recruits that the enemy's suffering was never a target, only a test. They spoke not of the glory of combat, but of the weight of mercy. At Fort Sam Houston, where the U.S. Army Medical School was reorganized in the 1950s, instructors quoted the wartime ethos almost as scripture. "We fight to win battles. We heal to remain human." That distinction became the invisible thread holding together the profession of military medicine through Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan. Even when war grew more mechanized and distant, the image of the World War II medic, kneeling in the mud, cross on his helmet, enemy at his feet, remained the moral archetype of what it meant to be a civilized soldier. In Europe, too, the lesson endured. West Germany, rebuilding from ashes, adopted a new doctrine for its Bundeswehr in the 1950s. Innere Führung, leadership guided by conscience. It was a direct rejection of blind obedience, inspired partly by the behavior of Allied troops who had shown humanity amid ruin. Thus, the very men who had once trembled in American hospitals became the architects of a new ethical military, one defined not by fear, but by moral clarity. And yet, for decades, few spoke publicly about those nights in the tents. The soldiers who had been saved often buried the memory under layers of guilt. The doctors who had shown mercy carried it quietly, unsure how to explain compassion in the language of war. It was not until the 1970s that historians began collecting testimonies from German POWs treated by the Americans. Many broke down while recalling the simplest gestures: a blanket, a cigarette, a kind word. One former infantryman said through tears, "That was the first time I understood freedom. It wasn't in victory, it was in kindness." The archives tell no grand story of peace treaties or flags raised. They tell something smaller and far more enduring. They tell of men and women who, when faced with the abyss, refused to step into it. Today, military cadets study those same case reports not just as medical records, but as moral lessons. They learn that the most dangerous wound of war is not physical. It is the loss of empathy. And that healing, even when given to an enemy, is the act that keeps civilization alive. The story of the German prisoners healed by American doctors is not about victory or defeat. It is about the moment when war stopped long enough for humanity to breathe. When the scalpel, not the rifle, became the instrument of moral triumph. In 1945, a medic somewhere in France scribbled a note on the back of a blood-stained log. "If we can save them, maybe we can save ourselves." That sentence never made it into official reports, but it remains the truest summary of what happened in those tents, and why it still matters. The war that began with thunder ended in silence. Not the silence of peace, but the silence that comes after too much has been said and lost. Europe lay scattered like broken glass across a table, and yet in that shattered reflection, a few clear truths endured. Among them was this: that mercy is not the opposite of strength. It is its purest form. The American doctors and medics who bent over their enemies' wounds in 1944 and 1945 may never have seen themselves as heroes. They were too tired, too burdened by the sight of what war had done to men's bodies and souls. But in their quiet defiance of vengeance, they achieved something armies rarely do. They changed the meaning of victory. They proved that civilization could survive even in the mud. The German prisoners who once trembled under their hands carried that lesson home. Some rebuilt cities, some rebuilt faith, and a few rebuilt medicine itself, teaching others that a man's worth is not decided by the flag on his uniform, but by the life still beating under his ribs. The years have turned those moments into history, but the echo remains. In every hospital that treats the wounded without asking where they came from, in every soldier who kneels beside an enemy and chooses compassion over cruelty. Because what began in those tents was more than an act of healing. It was a declaration that the future of humanity would not be written by those who destroy, but by those who choose to mend. And perhaps, in some quiet corner of the world, there is still a doctor who remembers the night he reached across the lines, saw the fear in an enemy's eyes, and realized that victory had already been won, not by power, but by mercy. The rifles rusted. The tents were folded. But the lesson endured, that even in war the human heart, if it keeps beating for others, is unbreakable.